Konnichiwa. Welcome to another intriguing tale from the annals of history.
In the early 1970s, the British political system had settled into a comfortable pattern. The Labour Party would win an election, and then the next time around, the Conservatives would win. Back and forth the power went, all fairly genteel and civilized. In fact, the two parties had come to resemble one another, but when the Conservatives lost in 1974, some of them had had enough. Wanting to shake things up, they proposed Margaret Thatcher as their leader. The party was divided that year, and Thatcher took advantage of the split and won the nomination. No one had ever seen a politician quite like Thatcher. A woman in a world run by men, she was also proudly middle class, the daughter of a grocer, in the traditional party of the aristocracy. Her clothes were prim, more like a housewife's than a politician's. She had not been a player in the Conservative Party. In fact, she was on its right-wing fringes. Most striking of all was her style. Where other politicians were smooth and conciliatory, she confronted her opponents, attacking them directly. She had an appetite for battle. Most politicians saw Thatcher's election as a fluke and didn't expect her to last. And in her first few years leading the party when Labour was in power, she did little to change their opinion. She railed against the socialist system, which in her mind had choked all initiative and was largely responsible for the decline of the British economy. She criticized the Soviet Union at a time of détente. Then in the winter of 1978 to 79, several public sector unions decided to strike. Thatcher went on the warpath, linking the strikes to the Labour Party and Prime Minister James Callaghan. This was bold, divisive talk, good for making the evening news, but not for winning elections. You had to be gentle with the voters, reassure them, not frighten them. At least that was the conventional wisdom. In 1979, the Labour Party called a general election. Thatcher kept on the attack, categorizing the election as a crusade against socialism and as Great Britain's last chance to modernize. Callaghan was the epitome of the genteel politician, but Thatcher got under his skin. He had nothing but disdain for this housewife-turned-politician, and he returned her fire. He agreed that the election was a watershed, for if Thatcher won, she would send the economy into shock. The strategy seemed partly to work. Thatcher scared many voters, and the polls that tracked personal popularity showed that her numbers had fallen well below Callaghan's. At the same time, though, her rhetoric and Callaghan's response to it polarized the electorate, which could finally see a sharp difference between the parties. Dividing the public into left and right, she charged into the breach, sucking in attention and attracting the undecided. She won a sizable victory. Thatcher had bowled over the voters, but now, as Prime Minister, she would have to moderate her tone, heal the wounds, according to the polls at any rate, that was what the public wanted. But Thatcher, as usual, did the opposite, enacting budget cuts that went even deeper than she had proposed during the campaign. As her policies played out, the economy did indeed go into shock, as Callaghan had said it would, and unemployment soared. Men in her own party, many of whom had by that point been resenting her treatment of them for years, began publicly to question her abilities. These men, whom she called the Wets, were the most respected members of the Conservative Party, and they were in a panic. She was leading the country into an economic disaster that they were afraid they would pay for with their careers. Thatcher's response was to purge them from her cabinet. She seemed bent on pushing everyone away. Her legion of enemies was growing, her poll numbers slipping still lower. Surely the next election would be her last. Then, in 1982, on the other side of the Atlantic, the military junta that ruled Argentina, needing a cause to distract the country from its many problems, invaded the Falkland Islands, a British possession to which, however, Argentina had a historical claim. The officers of the junta felt certain that the British would abandon these islands, barren and remote, but Thatcher did not hesitate. Despite the distance, 8,000 miles, she sent a naval task force to the Falklands. Labour leaders attacked her for this pointless and costly war. Many in her own party were terrified. If the attempt to retake the islands failed, the party would be ruined. Thatcher was more alone than ever, but much of the public now saw her qualities, which had seemed so irritating, in a new light. Her obstinacy became courage, nobility. Compared to the dithering, panty-waisted, careerist men around her, Thatcher seemed resolute and confident. The British successfully won back the Falklands, and Thatcher stood taller than ever. Suddenly, the country's economic and social problems were forgotten. Thatcher now dominated the scene, and in the next two elections, she crushed Labour.
Life is endless battle and conflict, and you cannot fight effectively unless you can identify your enemies. Learn to smoke out your enemies, to spot them by the signs and patterns that reveal hostility. Then, once you have them in your sights, inwardly declare war. Your enemies can fill you with purpose and direction.